In Module 11, we start looking forward. Forward for what could happen in the church and forward for what will happen with us after this earth. And so let's talk about the second topic first. So chapter 10 in your book talks about salvation in the communion of saints. And so this idea of salvation, like how are we saved, or what do we have to do on this earth in order to share eternal life with Jesus in the next? Some of this comes from the Hebrew scriptures. However, in the Hebrew scriptures, there wasn't a real solid sense about what happened to the body or to the person, the soul, after this earth. In the Hebrew scriptures, they definitely did talk about places where, like Gehenna, where the soul would go, the spirit would go after this earth, but it was always treated as sort of like a voidless place without God. And by the end of the Hebrew scriptures, the later books that were written, it describes this place as being the place for the damned, or those people who have sinned greatly. The scriptures, the New Testament scriptures, of course, go into more detail about this thanks to the resurrection of Jesus. And so Jesus rose from the dead. There are all sorts of resurrection accounts, moments where people talk to Jesus, including the Emmaus story, where it was the day of his resurrection. Two disciples are walking on the road. They're very confused. Jesus joins them and explains why everything happened the way it did and how it's all proof that Jesus is the Messiah and that everyone will share in this resurrection. And then right when they recognize him, it's in the breaking of bread, and then he disappears. Peter and Mary Magdalene also had encounters with the risen Christ, so did Paul. And all of this kind of leads to this teaching that if we live a good life on this earth, we can share in eternal life with Jesus. Some theologians believe that this will happen for those people who live a good life right when they die, and that everyone else will have to wait for some sort of judgment day. As far as Christian eschatology goes, it's really focused more resurrection, or it focused on both the resurrection of the body and of the soul. So we talk about heaven, hell, purgatory, and limbo. Heaven is a place where we get to have this beatific vision where we get to see God. And it might be more like a union with God rather than a place. And again, you'll read a lot about different theories and how that idea evolved. Hell would be like Gehenna, which again was like this place where the damned went. Gehenna was literally a place outside of Jerusalem where they sacrificed to the gods, but eventually it became the term used for hell in the Hebrew scriptures. And out of this comes the idea of Satan or the devil. And although there's all sorts of legend and lore about this, mostly based on things outside of the Bible, like Paradise Lost by John Milton, which talks about this fallen angel, the Catholic Church would just say that the devil or Satan was a normal human who, by free will, chose to reject God. We do believe that the devil's at work, though, in our world to try to take humanity away from God. Purgatory is like this purification process. I used to think of it more like a place, like a waiting room in a doctor's office, but it's really taught more as something that we have to go through on our way to heaven, and it purifies us so that we're worthy of heaven. And I know that there was a lot of talk, we'll talk more about that with indulgences in a minute, and you'll read more about that. And then finally, limbo was this place of eternal happiness for babies who died before they were baptized. But yet, even though they were happy in this place, they were kind of stuck there forever, and they never got to have this beatific vision of God. They never got to be reunited with God. The book then starts talking about the communion of saints, which makes sense as far as why they're connected, because we feel like we're connected on earth with those who've gone before us. And so that's kind of the idea of the communion of saints. And you'll read more about how the Eastern people translated that versus Western people. It does go into a talk about indulgences. This was kind of like, think of it like penance or like earthly punishment that we served. And so an indulgence, if you kind of ask the church to pray for your indulgence, then you might be freed of the earthly punishment. And this might save you time eventually in purgatory. And so some priests were making a lot of money off this in the Middle Ages. One in particular was John Tetzel, who Martin Luther knew about and Martin Luther complained about, and that's how it became so famous. As far as salvation today, our ideas of it, the old teaching used to be that only people who were Catholic could be saved. And we've come a long way in understanding that salvation can be for people outside of the Catholic faith, and that we do still believe that the Catholic faith holds the most truth. The next chapter, chapter 11, is about the unfinished agenda, and it mostly just asks a lot of important questions like, where will the church move as it moves forward? And so some people believe that Vatican II changed too much. Some people think it was right in the right direction, and we need to do more of that kind of changing. And so when we come to liturgy, some of the questions are about where do we place the altar? How do we design our churches so that more lay people are involved? What do we do about the growing shortage of priests? What about the permanent diaconate? Should that change? Should that include women? I think Pope Francis recently said he was open to that. Also, when we talk about doctrinal changes or changes to our doctrine, as far as teachings about annulment, that has changed recently. It's meant to be a much quicker process with only one judge rather than three, and annulment only needing to be approved in one diocese rather than two, and it should be free. There should be no cost to it, so that hopefully people can go through the annulment process quicker. As far as authority goes, the authority used to all be held within the church and the hierarchy of the church, but now lay people are able to have degrees in theology just like I do, and that includes women and men, and married people and single people. And so how will that change the authority of the church? One big question deals with women, an issue that I feel passionate about. Today, about 85% of the lay people who help with church ministries are women, and yet women don't have much of a role in the church. And we offer a new experience, and we have a different perspective that would be really healthy for the church to hear. And so how are we going to listen to the voice of women better in the future? One idea is to use feminine hermeneutics, which is trying to interpret the Bible from a female point of view, trying to kind of bring back to life those stories that show the importance of women and the role that women played in the early church. So I have a slide about important women, most of whom I think you know about, Eve and Ruth and Mary. Ruth you might not know as much about. There's a beautiful book in the Bible about her. She was widowed, and she, instead of going back to her family, stayed with her mother-in-law and wouldn't leave her mother-in-law alone. And together they kind of lived as single women, which was pretty radical. And then she married Boaz. Also, there's Mary Magdalene, who was the first to witness the resurrected Jesus in all four accounts from the Gospel. So the very first person that Jesus chose to show himself to. There's Prisca, or also known as Priscilla. She's the wife of Aquila, and apparently together they were missionaries and they told people about Jesus. At one point they kind of ran out of Rome. Paul knew them, and Paul applauded their great work. And 4 of the 6 times that they're mentioned, Priscilla or Prisca is mentioned first. There's also Lydia, who was the leader of a house church. Phoebe, who was given the title of diakonos, which is translated sometimes as deacon, but in her case was translated as helper. And then there's a person named Junia, who for a long time people thought was a male. And we think that she kind of had a sex change by translation, if you will, that at some point in the translation of the Bible, they changed her to a man because, again, they wanted to minimize the role that women played in the early church. I have a passage there from the Catechism about who is God, and this kind of gives proof that even though we always refer to God as him and he, that our Catholic Church teaches that God is neither male or female, that God is spirit, and God has to encompass both male and female attributes because we're made in his image and likeness, and I am made in his image and likeness too, which means that there has to be some feminine characteristics. And so I have a slide for an argument for using inclusive language. This would be language that instead of saying he says God, or takes gender out of the language as much as possible. Of course, we can't do that always, but this is some of the guidelines for what that might look like. Language is a very powerful thing, and it really persuades people from the earliest moments of their life. And if we can change that language, we might be able to give people more images of God that will be helpful to them in their relationship with God. And so I have a couple slides about that. Finally, there's a move for ecumenism, or an ecumenical movement, and this is trying to bring back the unity with other Christian churches and other churches in the world. which is all very important because we want to bring back unity and get rid of the divisions in the church. So that's what the future might look like for us in our salvation and for us in the church. Of course, those are a lot of questions that aren't answered yet, but some important questions that the church will need to answer.